Pleasure and a privilege to welcome our keynote speaker, Dr. Safiya Noble, who's joining us online. As you'll know, her work is defining for the discussion of how digital media impacts our lives today and intersects with issues of race, gender, culture, and technology. Dr. Noble's work has been an inspiration not only for this symposium, but for our entire project on attention after technology. Dr. Noble is an associate professor of gender studies and African American studies at the University of California in Los Angeles, UCLA, where she also founded the UCLA Center for Critical Internet Inquiry. Dr. Noble has a background in library and information science and in sociology, and she is 2021 MacArthur Fellow, a recipient of the inaugural NAACP-Archewell Digital Civil Rights Award, and author of the highly acclaimed Algorithms of Oppression, How Search Engines Reinforce Racism from 2018. Dr. Noble and her work have been featured in media such as Time, The Guardian, the BBC, CNN International, as well as in a host of network news and podcasts. She is the co-editor of two anthologies, namely The Intersectional Internet, Race, Sex, Culture, and Class Online, and Emotions, Technology, and Design. Her popular writing includes critiques on the loss of public goods to big tech companies, as featured, for instance, in Noema magazine. Dr. Noble is a board member of the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative, serving those vulnerable to online harassment. She was recently appointed as a board member for the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies, America's Black think tank. In 2021, she founded a nonprofit, the Equity Engine, to accelerate investment in companies, education, and networks driven by women of color. Katrine K. Pedersen will respond to Dr. Noble's lecture before we open up to questions from the floor. And the title of Dr. Noble's talk is Algorithms of Oppression, How Search Engines Reinforce Racism. I'm looking very much forward to this.
Good morning. Thank you so much for that kind introduction. And I so wish that I were with you today in person. Instead, I'm joining you here from Los Angeles, where it is raining, believe it or not, on one of the rare days that it rains in Los Angeles. But I'm also joining you from the unceded territory of the Tonga people. And it's in this unceded territory that we are also always contesting the conditions under which we live and work. And so I just want to say thank you so much for this, this great opportunity. I'm also joining you from the unceded territory of the Tonga and Gabrielino peoples, where I live and work. And I just want to say that it's really a pleasure to be a part of this conference with you and this conversation. And I'm going to talk a little bit about algorithms of oppression, but I also feel like this is such a unique opportunity, thinking through the lens of kind of humanistic frameworks on the kind of work we all do. And so I want to share some ideas and some provocations that I've also learned along the way, both in the writing of this book, Algorithms of Oppression, but also really since. And I want to say that it's so energizing and amazing to see this convening that you're having today, thinking about social justice and algorithms, AI, and all the ways that we can complicate that through art and other kinds of provocations, which I think elevate, quite frankly, the conversations that the industry puts forward and gives us opportunity for pause and reflection. You can see here even this image. This is, an image from an e-waste site. And of course, this was taken in Accra, Ghana, a place that previously was a pristine, gorgeous wetland in the heart of the city and became a huge site for all kinds of waste, not just electronic waste. But, when I spent a couple of years ago there, researching a next project, I found it so incredible that even among the ways that we articulate the possibilities and the, I would say, overhyped promises of what digital technologies can do for us, there are these dimensions that we ignore, like the waste or the extraction. And so we can talk about some of that today. We're going to have lots of time for questions and conversation after these provocations. And, I will just also say that, while those things are hidden from sight from people in the global north or in the west or in the places of the global minority, quite frankly, there's also still new life pushing through. And I love these blades of grass and these leaves because they remind me metaphorically that, no matter like what destruction we bring associated or tied to the human condition and human projects, Earth will still find its way forward. And I think that is also a source to learn from and to pay attention to. So let me just start by saying that I want to locate myself in a community of other Black scholars who, in particular, I think have opened up these conversations. I mean, obviously, we've been watching, this week in the news, we saw, one of the godfathers of AI resign from Google, who because he's concerned about the dangers of AI and has finally met his personal limit. And yet there were so many scholars and journalists and activists who've been writing about the harms of technology, or let's say the limits, certainly many of the affordances, there's no question, and affordances for people for whom many of these technologies and projects were not designed, or they were communities that were not centered in those, design imaginaries. But certainly many of us I don't know, I think of my work starting kind of my public critical work of Google and search engines and kind of the tech sector writ large, going back to about 2010, 2011. And of course, people like, Alondra Nelson and Anna Everett writing, much earlier than that about the overlooked contributions and the ways that Silicon Valley, let's say, might have emerged differently had many voices of color not been erased or ignored or pushed to the periphery. Charlton McElwain here has written a brilliant book, Black Software, that really is the counter narrative of Silicon Valley. And of course, the many people who are helping us understand the consequences, whether it's in video gaming or in algorithmic design or new possibilities and different types of design possibilities in the work of people like Ruha Benjamin. So I share this because I want, one, to expose more people in the world to these thinkers, and also because I want you to know that my work stands, in a community of other scholars whose work I have been inspired by, and whose conversations keep us energized at a time when I feel like new technologies like generative AI are flatlining some folks, making us feel that the scale of unleashed ungovernable technologies onto societies around the world feels incredibly difficult to call back. And I'm sure this is not unlike other moments in history where technological innovations, or let's say unwieldy projects that had not been thought through completely. And I think of this more so in terms of military weapons advancement, those things, they come to be, they come into existence and they change things. And so we are in certainly a very big moment, I think, again, of rapid change. And so we should talk about some of that. And I'd like to talk about that with you as well. One thing I want you to know about algorithms of oppression, it was this book that was kind of the first of its kind to incorporate or center, let's say, issues of race, a feminist lens and inquiry onto a company like Google. But it also, I think, quite frankly, shocking to me, spawned a whole bunch of different kinds of projects that have taken on a life of their own. And I'm going to share one of those at the end of this talk. But there were so many kind of art installations and book clubs and even new software and search art projects that envisioned search in different kinds of ways, including analog and non-digital ways. And I think one of the things that is so important is this relationship between scholars or intellectuals, academics, researchers, and makers of all types, and how we can find a way to visualize or touch or engage with other kinds of possibilities. And so that was one of the things that I think was so interesting to me about this book. And I'm really grateful to the so many people who took it up and wrestled with it and did all kinds of different things, wrote poetry. I have a painting here in my house that someone did that they sent me. Just ways, though, to provoke our thinking about what does it mean when we have monopolistic control over our information landscape by one company or a handful of companies. And I think what's really interesting in this moment around search is that we know that there are kind of two quite formidable challengers, if you will, to Google search, which has been the dominant search engine of our times here, of the last decade for sure, or more. One of those, of course, is generative AI and this idea of chatbots coming to replace search engines and providing what looks or appears to be a more sophisticated answer machine, if you will. Of course, we want to remember the work of people like Dr. Timnit Gebru, who was the head of ethical AI for Google, who was fired when she wrote a paper with Professor Emily Bender and her colleague Margaret Mitchell about the harms of the new large language model that Google was developing. Their paper is so important to helping us understand. It's called Stochastic Parrots, was kind of how we reference it. You can find it if you look for it under Stochastic Parrots, Bender and Gebru. And one of the things that we know is that generative AI, for example, as this kind of new and emerging, of course, Google's been working on its own version of generative AI that would come to replace the kind of search engine experience that we have. That was really, it appears in so many ways to give us these anthropomorphized interactions. So it feels like a human, right? It's designed to take on these human creative expressions and output in the way that it does its pattern matching. And really, we want to always remember that these technologies, they're doing a kind of predictive text matching, predicting which words should come after the word before in relationship to the prompt. I find that to be like a really important dimension that we talk about and that we remember, that the more that these technologies seem to mimic what human beings do, how human beings speak, the more vulnerable human beings are to believing that these technologies are superior to our own ways of knowing, our own ways of thinking, our own ways of experiencing. And of course, there are so many dimensions of integrating knowledge or coming to understand knowledge. I have a colleague at UCLA, Professor Rachel Lee, who researches what smell, for example, does to our integration of information, right? So there are these other sensory kinds of experiences that are so important to the way we come to understand and think about our information and knowledge uptake, consumption, engagement. So this is one of the things that I think is really important to kind of think about as we continue to bring forward these kind of critical analyses of technologies. The second major threat, I think, to the kind of traditional search engine models that we've been used to is TikTok and the way in which young people, quite frankly, are telling us quite a bit about the future of their knowledge seeking patterns and what they're interested in, which is counterintuitive at a moment of generative AI, but it is looking for other human beings to share ideas, share information, share knowledge, share culture. So I find that to be an incredibly rich landscape upon which we are thinking about the future of knowledge and information. Now, I'll just say that one thing that I think is just a helpful background or two in addition to that book is that we have not had enough, even though, I have tried to do some of my own work. I mean, I think that we are just at the beginning of understanding the harms of a variety of different kinds of digital technologies to people of color, people who have been historically discriminated against and oppressed in the United States, certainly against Black and Indigenous communities. We have really the work of understanding and scoping and making sense of harm against the public is generally being done by journalists, by artists, by activists, by scholars, researchers. And I think this, again, is another place where we have to ask ourselves, what does it mean that the industry can really design its products, unleash them on the public, and then the tracking of faulty products, if you will, if we put it into kind of the context of consumer products, that the tracking and the flagging and the raising of concern to legislative bodies, government bodies, regulatory bodies around the world, and to the companies themselves is really outsourced and offloaded onto various publics. And I think that's another thing that we need to be thinking about as these products come into place. And then really the incredibly disproportionate amount of resource that goes to those of us who do that kind of work. So that's something, again, a food for thought for us to think about in terms of how we are resourced to defend the public from dangerous technologies. So, one of the things that excuse me, you can hear my voice is a little bit raspy today. I've been fighting a cold. But one of the things that I think is so valuable about what humanists and social scientists bring to our inquiries about the digital is that, we have these theoretical frameworks and these ways to assess and understand history that are so incredibly important. And yet so many of the projects that come out of the field kind of at the intersection of the digital and humanities are often kind of invested in, whether it's now I'm dating myself, whether it's kind of these older school digital projects of data mining a corpus of text to understand, how many patterns of thought and ideas, words might emerge, or using technologies in a way to uncritically examine different kinds of community or public projects, or to kind of raise up centers of expertise in universities and in communities that really often, I think, are focused on the technology or kind of novel uses of technology in certain kinds of questions. And yet the core possibility of using these technologies to undo legacies of colonization, to create new liberatory possibilities for communities and for the public and for how we reimagine and redesign our societies. This to me is one of the, let's say, possibilities that we have not fully explored, or we should press on more fully, rather than kind of those of us who are in the West thinking about new ways to use R or statistical software or predictive tools to look to the past and not bring that knowledge forward, which I can tell you, really, it happens very much in the university. These are the things that I think are missed opportunities for us. And so I've been trying to write and think about those things, and interested to think through those things with you too. You know, what this provocation is really thinking about kind of, rather than using all the resources just toward kind of reifying some of these digital projects. And I can share with you, for example, in our Center on Race and Digital Justice, we allocate resources toward what I think of as basic research and understanding new phenomena, studying generative AI, for example. But then we also put resources in service of communities who are working in cities around the United States, who need the language and the evidence from research to go to city councils and work against things like facial recognition, and to generate facial recognition bans, or to speak back to policymakers, or to provide testimony in different kinds of state and local bodies, and even federal conversations that would help regulate or reduce the harm or use, in some cases altogether, of these technologies in our communities. So these practices, the way in which we can engage with research and have it make a transformative impact with people in communities, to me, is so incredibly important when I think about this. And I've articulated this in talking about using the digital to digitize Black culture, but not using it in service of dismantling racist systems that contain and constrain freedom for Black bodies or for Black people. That is the kind of intersection where I think we have more work to do and more possibility. So I think about some of the things that we can do, and I try to this is of course not exhaustive, but it's just a way to help us start to get some bite-sized pieces of what are the things we can do. I think one of the things that is inspiring about this conference that you're having is that we are making visible that the public can no longer deny, and the industry can no longer deny, that its tools and projects are implicated in things like the rise of global inequality. We want to remember that digital systems are really reliant upon things like global racialized labor exploitation. We can't have the microprocessor chips, in this laptop that I'm using, or in this phone that's keeping track of my time now, without extractive labor practices in places like the Congo, for example, where miners have to mine minerals to make microprocessor chips, or in places like Accra, where I mentioned earlier, where e-waste workers have to sift through and parse and deal with the remnants of some of our folly. And so I think of that as being so incredibly important. And this supply chain, here I think of the work of Professor Miriam Posner, who's written incredible work about global technology supply chains, and all of the labor and decisions that are largely invisible to us as we work as consumers with these products that reinforce all kinds of broad neocolonial historical patterns of exploitation, labor exploitation. So that to me is so incredibly important that we keep surfacing this. And I think we need to truly counter-narrate with what will be lost through technological flattening of the human experience. So when I say that, what I mean is the technological flattening for me is the ways in which data come to represent who we are. In the United States, we have government officials who say things like, as far as the government is concerned, our digital profiles are who we are, rather than who we are being who we are. And so think about all of the thousands of data brokers who are constantly buying, selling, and trading information about us, making new data profiles about us every time we log into a new system, excuse me, engage with, sorry, every time we're engaging with new systems where we have to click terms of service, accept to agreements, we are making and generating more data profiling about ourselves. And I think this is so incredibly important that we understand the degree to which those data profiles have come to be the proxy for our humanity and for who we are as human beings, and not just human beings, but other creatures of the earth. And so this is such a powerful place where we need to not only push back on digital profiles and digital profiling. Of course, we know from people like Cathy O'Neill in her book, Weapons of Math Destruction, that profiling serves to make the lives of people who are already doing great better, and really make the lives of those who are not doing well even worse. And then I think, lastly, we can really no longer pretend that these digital infrastructures are not linked to crises like global warming and other impending ecological disasters. One of the things that was so powerful and important about that work of Emily Bender and Timnit Gebru and Margaret Mitchell that I mentioned, what I notice here is I keep citing women too, because these are the people who've written the work to me that has really been sounding the alarm so much. But in their work about large language models, they shared with us that the environmental drain that large language models, and I know some of you, in fact, probably at this conference are very familiar with other older projects that were incredible drains on the environment, and that took up a disproportionate amount of energy that's used, again, in Western countries over other countries. I think of this as like the way in which the global minority in terms of population takes a disproportionate amount of energy from the environment to fuel our projects, and the consequences of that. And so even the technologies that are being unleashed on the public, we don't have sufficient ways to capture what those ecological disasters are. I live in a place, quite frankly, California, where we face ecological crises all the time: fires, mudslides, flooding now, which is so interesting for a place like California. And then we're in a 500-year drought, right? So here we are in the birthplace of Silicon Valley, a state that is profoundly under-resourced and impacted. Of course, one of the challenges of decolonizing the web, these tools and these practices, is thinking about the distribution of resources. We are so challenged around the world with what happens when tech companies come into our communities, the degree to which they do not pay taxes, they offshore their profits, they consolidate power, and are largely ungovernable. And so when we think about every layer, not just kind of who the major tech companies are, but every dimension of how the digital stack, if you will, the infrastructures of the internet around the world, at every site, there's opportunity to think about what it would mean to decolonize the practices, the business practices, the design practices at each of those layers. And to me, that's a really incredible way of thinking about the kind of impact that we can have. The last thing I'll say is that art and conceptions of people have really shaped society so profoundly. When I was writing Algorithms of Oppression, I was looking at these old media images. These are, racist depictions of Black women and Black girls that have been with us for centuries. And those were the kinds of images and ideas that were replicated when you did searches on Black women and girls in a search engine. And so this relationship between culture and technology is so incredibly important. The way in which, as we know right now, so much is pulled into these systems and then kind of regurgitated back out without a proper context or a way to analyze what these images mean. If you didn't know, for example, about the history of enslavement and oppression of African peoples in the United States and in the West and in the Caribbean and South America, you might not understand the way in which these kinds of images were used and weaponized to dehumanize Black people, Black women and girls, so that the justification of their abuse could be normalized and actually persist for hundreds of years. So these old ideas get reinscribed into new technologies, but they do so in ways that are so uncritically examined and that in fact normalize the dehumanization. And I think these things are really important to look at. Of course, that for those of you who know this book, these were the kinds of things that I was looking at, these results when looking up identities of people of color, women, girls, and finding over and over whether it was kind of pornography or hypersexualized ideas about women, much more acute around women of girls, Asian women, Black women, Latina women and girls. But what does it mean, again, to have these things played back to us in such a banal way? I mean, there's nothing more boring, quite frankly, to study than search engines. And yet it's in the kind of everyday use of something that we take for granted that when we look more closely, we're able to problematize it. And I think, of course, we think of the millions of students in classrooms around the world who use search engines and whose teachers and parents, children whose mentors and people who are guiding them through their learning turn to these technologies for inquiry and relate to them like truth tellers, like encyclopedic knowledge, or libraries, or places where you can kind of quickly fact check. And this to me seems so important in this moment where we have more understanding and critique, I think, about social media, but we fail to realize the degree to which people might come across things that they don't trust in social media, but they will turn quickly to a search engine like a fact checker. These media representations and misrepresentations, truly, and Oscar Gandy and Jessica Davis writing about this all the way back in 1999, really are implicated in these contemporary projects of redistributing resources in ways that benefit dominant groups at the expense of others. And never has this been more profound for us in the United States right now, where we have, I think yesterday I heard over 529 anti-LGBTQ bills that have been raised up in state legislatures all around the United States. We have hundreds of anti-critical race theory bills that are also being uh, uh, circulated in state houses. And I think constantly about the degree to which a project like the internet has played such a significant role in rolling back civil rights, human rights, sovereign rights, in redistributing resources away from marginalized communities, in this case, a total erasure of communities in this political moment. And so these things are so incredibly important for us to understand the interrelatedness between a variety of different projects and how they reshape and remake society and culture at the expense of traditionally oppressed people. So let me just share this last project that with you. There's a wonderful organization called Feminist AI here in California, and they have done some amazing, and I just wanted to give you their URL, and I wanted you to know about them because they've done some very provocative work with the way in which they code and try to imagine things like what would a feminist search engine look like. Even the question to me is so interesting. Of course, one of the things in algorithms of repression that I called for is many, many, many search engines rather than one monopoly leader in any given part of the world, because what that does is it helps us to understand, one, the major commercial search engines as advertising engines, which is truly what they are. They are drivers of advertising content, and distinguish that from other kinds of knowledge systems that we might engage with and generate. And so feminist AI has had these provocative questions like, what would it mean to create feminist search? And I think they're really worth knowing. And this is a collective of programmers and artists and activists who are doing incredible work. Ultimately, I think they know, like I know, and I know many of you know, that these issues that I'm talking about today around global social inequality, harm that comes, these things are not going to be solved by more new apps. My students at UCLA are always trying to, tell me about these incredible projects, especially the engineering students and new apps. And, I'm always pushing back to them and saying, like, if you want to show me something amazing, show me how we're going to, when we're finished with this phone, plant it in the ground and grow trees. Help us understand how to do more than a software layer, but think about all the layers, as I said, of hardware, of infrastructure, but also, of course, ways to do more than just kind of gamify the issues that are so profound that we are dealing with in this world right now. And so this is just another provocation and a way to think about the work that we're doing. The last thing I'll say, and this is really one of my favorite lines from the book that I wrote, which is really this idea that we have more data and technology than ever. And we, for every year that we track global inequality, every year is worse than the year before. And so the question is, to me, the provocation continues to be, we have these promises that the digital will somehow democratize the world. And yet we have more precarious democratic institutions than ever. We have the rise of authoritarianism, and we have a slew of crises before us. And so the question to me, and I think that's so interesting, and I hope this conversation will be helpful as you are engaged in this conference, is, how can we push ourselves harder to not only raise the concerns, but intervene upon them? And I know it feels daunting for me, certainly when I look out at the billions of dollars that we are up against that are resourcing what I think of as anti-democratic and anti-human, and certainly anti-Black, anti-people of color, anti-LGBTQ, anti-women kinds of projects. And those are not in anybody's interest, quite frankly. I sometimes I share in certain audiences in the United States that these are worries we should have, all of this, that will affect all of us and affect all of our communities. There's really no one who will be untouched by their erasure of our humanity through so many digital projects. And so I'm really grateful to be in this conversation with you. And I think I'll stop there. I'm sure I'm over time. Thank you.